Good evening there, everybody. What is happening? Hopefully, you all are having a wonderful day today. So, when it comes down to it, I thought that I would review this little video that I found very particularly interesting. And this is going to be another video by Mr. Boxing Ego that I'm going to review. And the reason why I found this video very particularly interesting is because there's going to be a lot of things to talk about in this video. But the main conversation, the main point and topic is to talk about probably two, at least, of the debatable top 10 pound for pound fighters, maybe three, maybe even four, because the main fighters that we're going to be talking about in this video are going to be one, Terence Bud Crawford, two, Errol Spence Jr., three, Jamel Charlo, and maybe even a little bit of Saul Canelo Alvarez as well, even though he's not directly a part of this conversation. The reason why he may get brought up a little bit here and there is because Mr. Boxing Ego is going to bring him up here and there, especially when talking about complete unifications. But anyways, recently, for those of you that do not know what this conversation is about, and I'm not really sure what I'm going to title this video, but recently, Mr. Jamel Charlo, who is the complete unified champion of the 154-pound weight division, and recently became so when he ended up winning the rematch against Brian Gastano and ended up knocking him out, I believe, within the 10th round. Overall, a very decent performance by Mr. Jamel Charlo. Anyways, when it came down to it, Jamel Charlo, who I believe is very good friends with Mr. Errol Spence Jr., he recently stated something about Terence Bud Crawford to where not only did he criticize the type of competition that Terence Bud Crawford usually faces, but he also stated that if Terence Bud Crawford, at least in his view, went up to 154 pounds, that he would barely make it. And what he meant by that is that he does not believe that Terence Bud Crawford would be able to unify there. In fact, he even went as far to state that he does not even believe that Terence Crawford would last a full fight against the fighter Erickson Lubin. Do I necessarily agree with that? No, I don't. But we're going to talk about that in this video. I just thought that that would be very particularly interesting. But Mr. Boxing Ego is going to talk about it. And the reason why I thought that I would talk about it is because I do think that Mr. Boxing Ego brings up some decent points within this video. And there's some of the same points all in all that I've been stating about Mr. Terence Bud Crawford for years upon years upon years. And many people will state all in all that Terence Bud Crawford, that he is allegedly number one pound per pound. And don't get me wrong, if you want to put him there right now, I don't really have a problem with it. But the biggest problem in my view with 100% debating that Terence Bud Crawford is the true number one pound per pound fighter. Now, ever since Canelo Alvarez lost, I don't think that there's a problem with really putting him there. But the biggest problem with Terence Bud Crawford is his resume. And when I say resume, I'm talking about a fighter that, all in all, has not just won belts or unified a division. I'm talking about a fighter that has faced usually repeated champion after repeated champion or repeated A-grade fighters. And we're going to talk about that in this video. We're going to talk about Mr. Jamel Charlo's unification. We're going to talk about Alexander Usyk's unification. We're going to talk about Terence Bud Crawford's unification and maybe other unifications that I have not brought up, as well. But anyways, Mr. Boxing Ego is going to talk about it. I thought that it was a very particularly interesting conversation. Let's get into it.
Lines only, yeah. Keep running your mouth. Terence Crawford is warned not to move up or almost dared to move up to fight Erickson Lubin or someone of that caliber. Jamel Charlo says Lubin would beat Crawford. That's what we're going to talk about right now, right here. What up, Fight World? It's your boy Ego, and I'm back with some more boxing. Now, before I get started with the content, you guys got to do a solid to the channel. We just hit 300K, and the sky is the limit, like Biggie Smalls said. You got to hit the subscribe button. You got to like the video and leave me a comment. SLC, subscribe, like, and comment. Now, undisputed champion Jermell Charlo, he recently, spoke on a situation, and that was Terence Crawford, right? He says, in Europe, I'm trying to get that bag. So, it looks like he's on some kind of vacation or business trip. He also says, I KO'd better oppositions ever done. So I think he's trying to say I KO'd better opposition than he has ever done. Let's compare.
That is pretty much what Mr. Jamel Charlo was stating. And basically, what Jamel Charlo was stating is that who has Terence Bud Crawford really ever beat? When we talk about his unification and my unification, it really is not comparable. Now, do I 100% agree with that? Well, what I will say is this. I think that the fight that Jamel Charlo had with Brian Gastano, I think that that more than likely is probably a bigger win than any of the wins in Mr. Terence Bud Crawford's career. And some people may completely disagree with that. Some people may say, well, what about Sean Porter? What about Yuriorkis Gamboa? I don't know if I'd put any of those fighters above a Brian Gastano. When Brian Gastano overall was facing Jamel Charlo, it was looked at as a true 50-50 fight both of those times. It's almost kind of like the Canelo versus Gennady Golovkin fights. Now, do I believe that Brian Gastano was ever on the same level as a, quote unquote Gennady Golovkin? No, not necessarily, but at least with Jamel Charlo that when he won that fight against Brian Gastano, that was a true, real challenge. That was looked at as a true 50-50 fight. And I would give Brian Gastano the grade of probably an A minus, probably somewhere around the same level of a Sean Porter. But I would say that Brian Gastano, in my opinion, at his best, you could debate is better than Sean Porter. So when Jamel Charlo states all in all that I've beaten better competition than what the dude ever has, I'm not going to 100% disagree with that, but in my view, it's really not by much. Jamel Charlo, in my view, when you really take a look at his resume, I don't think that it's super duper A grade either. And I've already stated this a multitude of times on my channel. There's been some people that have agreed with me, some people that have disagreed with me. I do not have Jamel Charlo on my personal top 10 pound per pound list. And some people may say, well, how could you say that? Because Jamel Charlo not only has a loss in his career just a couple of years ago to, in my opinion, either a very low grade B grade fighter or a debatable C grade fighter against Tony Harrison, but I also thought that he clearly should have lost the first Brian Gastano fight. And the rest of the wins in his career, it would have been a little bit different in my view had it been a Canelo Alvarez situation to where when Canelo did get that first controversial decision over Gennady Golovkin, he at least still had Araceli Lara and Chavez and, he had Miguel Cotto when it came down to it. So at least you could still debate even when that happened that Canelo more than likely still had to be on your top 10 pound per pound list. If we really take away that Brian Gastano win, what else does Jamel Charlo really have in his career? I mean, he has a win over Jason Rosario, but I never looked at Jason Rosario as a fighter that, in my view, was an A-grade fighter. I think that Jason Rosario is another Jeff Horn, or he's another one of these fighters that ended up getting the belt over a fighter that more than likely heavily underestimated them or was just a bad style. Kind of like a George Kambosos over Teofimo Lopez, or kind of all in all, like, when Andrew Ruiz was able to beat Anthony Joshua. Or even if you don't want to make that comparison, maybe when Buster Douglas beat Mike Tyson. You know the type of fighters that I'm talking about. Anyways, that's not me trying to, shit all over Jamel Charlo's resume, but I just don't see Jason Rosario, Tony Harrison. The only fighter that I see that Jamel Charlo beat in that weight division as clear A grade was Brian Gastano. And he gets a lot of props from me on that. I'm not shitting all over Jamel Charlo's resume. I understand what he's trying to state, but I really don't understand why so many people are really trying to put it out there that this is one of the deepest divisions in boxing, because it's truly not. When we really take a look at a certain amount of the A-grade fighters, let me put it in this perspective. If Canelo Alvarez was still fighting at 160 pounds, and if you had Jamel Charlo, Brian Gastano, Tony Harrison, Jason Rosario, if you had any of those fighters facing Canelo Alvarez, how many of those fighters would you give a 50 to 40% chance over Canelo Alvarez? You wouldn't give any of those fighters a 50 or 40% chance over Canelo Alvarez. And in my opinion, for you to be overall a very decent fighter, you have to be usually good, or at least very good, within a multitude of weight divisions. And if Canelo Alvarez, for example, even Jamel Charlo, I don't think any of those fighters would beat Jamel Charlo if they were to move up. So that's really my point when it comes down to it. That, in my opinion, is a sign of a fighter that is decently great. When I just take a look at the 154-pound weight division, who really is there other than Jamel Charlo that is a clear A-grade caliber fighter? Brian Gastano, of course, before he ended up losing, to Jamel Charlo. But when it came down to it, other than that, who really there is A-grade? So even though Jamel Charlo, he is, I understand what he's getting at. And I think that, from his perspective, it certainly is the truth. He does not always have the greatest amount of names on his resume either. And I'm not going to blame that on him. He beat whoever he needed to beat for the 154, for the 154-pound weight division. But at the end of the day, there really is not a huge difference between Jamel Charlo's resume in terms of how many A-grade fighters he's fought and Terence Bud Crawford. So it just is what it is.
Who knocked out, right? who dude knocked out. And people were, so he's undisputed now. Terence Crawford was undisputed previously, and I'll connect the dots by the end of this video. And he said, who has he knocked out? Like, I guess he's saying who of note, who of stature. He says Erickson, and this is kind of where it lets you know, Jamel lets you know that he's referring to Terence Crawford. He said Erickson Lubin will KO TC, Terence Crawford. You know, people call him TC, TBC.
Do I agree that Erickson Lubin would KO Terence Bud Crawford? No, I do not. Now, it would be very interesting to see how Terence Bud Crawford would handle the 154-pound weight division, because Terence Bud Crawford has never really been outsized by any particular opponent in his career. And some people may disagree with me. They'll be like, what are you talking about? Victor Postal was a little bit, lengthier than him, and he was a little bit taller than him, and, he's not a natural 147-pounder. Well, actually, that's not the truth. When you take a look at Terence Bud Crawford, even when he was fighting all the way back at 160 pounds, when he was fighting all the way back at 140 pounds, a lot of people don't know this about Terence Bud Crawford, but it was the same thing with Miguel Cotto back in the day. Miguel Cotto would rehydrate all the way up to 160 pounds, and it's the same thing with Terence Bud Crawford. And if you're, basically what your natural weight class is, you have to take that person's natural weight and you have to subtract it by about 13 or 15 pounds. Terence Bud Crawford, all in all, that means that if you take his regular walking around weight and if you subtract 15 pounds, his weight is 145 pounds. He is a natural welterweight. It just is what it is. All right, Terence Bud Crawford is a natural welterweight, and on top of that, he's 5'8" with a 74-inch arm reach. So Terence Bud Crawford has never really truly been outsized in his career. The 154-pound division, that would probably be the first time to where he would be slightly outsized. That's why whenever I talk about Canelo Alvarez and him going to 168 and overall him going to 175. Now, to be fair, Canelo is a big boy in terms of where he rehydrates. He's a person that, all in all, he rehydrates even sometimes up damn near 190. But when you take a look at Canelo Alvarez, he's not that big in terms of his length. He's a guy that has a 71-inch reach and is about 5'8" to 5'9". All right, so he's facing fighters that if you take a look at it in the ring, sometimes these fighters look double his size, whether it be a Caleb Plant or whether it be a Gennady Golovkin. I watched the Danny Jacobs fight the other day. Go ahead and take a look at that fight, and Danny Jacobs in certain moments looks twice the size as what a Canelo Alvarez does. So that's why when Canelo Alvarez is able to move up the weight divisions, especially against A-grade caliber fighters, at least usually, and win these type of belts and win these fights, that's why it is looked at on a very special level. Because you have to be a great fighter to do the things that Canelo can do. Now, don't get me wrong, what Jamel Charlo and Terence Bud Crawford have done is also great as well. But in my view, Canelo has just done it to a greater degree, especially moving up the weight divisions.
Says Erickson Lubin will KO Terence Crawford, move up to 154 pounds, and C. So he's standing on that.
And as for Alexander Usyk, we'll talk about his unification here in a bit.
Lions only. He's saying that, compare my reign for undisputed and compare Bud Crawford, his reign at undisputed in the 140-pound division. And you tell me, who's doing it, who's really doing it. And listen, I'm not going to disagree because I agree with what he just said because I said it. I told you. Listen, there's no knock on, on my channel, I don't do the beta male energy. You know what I mean? I just give you my points of view.
Well, that's not completely true, Mr. Ego, because whenever it comes to a fighter that you don't tend to like, whether it be all in all Canelo Alvarez or even sometimes a Terence Bud Crawford, even though I don't think that you have a hatred towards Terence Crawford, you just tend to like Errol Spence Jr. more. Or when it comes to a Tyson Fury or someone of that caliber, no, it's very clear that you have a personal issue with them. So even though Mr. Ego will bring up certain logical points here and there, no, I'm sorry, sir, I can't agree with you that you don't overall, do this quote-unquote beta male energy. That's why whenever a Canelo Alvarez fight comes on, you always try to tear down the numbers and you always basically try to tear down, certain facts that are just very apparent. It just is what it is. Anyway.
Hit record, hit stop, and I keep it trucking. I don't have nothing personal against
because there's a difference all in all between someone stating that, I want to see these fights and just, not to get sidetracked. But for some of the people that may ask, oh, well, because I've had certain people that come on my channel and they say this, oh, well, it makes Boxing Ego a hater just because, he wants to see the biggest fights with Canelo. No, that doesn't make you a hater at all. There's no problem with asking for the fights that you want to see with Canelo Alvarez, but no matter what Canelo or certain fighters that he tends not to like do, he's just never happy with what they do. At one point in time, all in all, he'll state that it's a very decent fight, but then afterwards, if Canelo is victorious, he'll basically all in all state, oh, it was a bust, it wasn't a good fight. He's cherry picking all these other guys, and that's what every single one of these channels do. Whether it be Ego or Dante or Aki, every single one of these channels, they all do the same thing.
Any fighter, ain't no fighter done
And
that.
keep in mind that this is the same guy that also alleged that Tyson Fury cheated with his gloves in the Deontay Wilder fights. So you tell me, with a straight and logical face, that all know these guys are an objective channel. They're not.
To me. So I just give you guys my thoughts. That being said, it is what it is. Terence Crawford, I respect him as a fighter. I think he's a great fighter. I've covered many of his fights, covered his career. I want him to do well, those types of things. He's an American fighter, a black American at that. Shout out to Block Ballin for subscribing. Make sure you guys subscribe to the channel. So, I want to see him thrive. He seems like a great dude and a family man, and he got skills, ambidextrous. What can I say? However, I'm not going to lie and say that his reign, all undisputed processes are not the same. It is what it is. And I think the same thing about Canelo Alvarez. Canelo Alvarez, him becoming undisputed, yeah, he was undisputed. Yeah, there's no doubt about that. But his journey to undisputed, I'm not going to compare it to Bernard Hopkins or Lennox Lewis or
I need to know overall what fighters Bernard Hopkins ended up actually beating. I need to know who he's paying off for people to talk so positively about him. I just recently made a video about Bernard Hopkins in my view, and I've already stated this. And once again, people can disagree with me. I really don't give a shit. Bernard Hopkins was the most overrated great fighter of all time. Not even a close second. Most overrated great fighter of all time. I don't know one big 50-50 fight that this dude ever won. Then name me one besides Felix Tito Trinidad where he was decently sized against him. And don't get me wrong, I still give I still give him a great amount of credit. But once again, that's like all in all, if Canelo, or excuse me, if Dimitri Bivol ends up defeating Canelo Alvarez, but he can't beat Artur Beterbiev, or Gilberto Zurdo Ramirez, and then people call him an all-time great fighter, like that just doesn't make any sense. It is what it is. Now, Bernard Hopkins, he ended up beating enough, in my opinion, to be called an all-time great fighter. He still was able to beat Kelly Pavlik and Winky Wright and Felix Tito Trinidad and Oscar De La Hoya. But when it came to the 50-50 fights against fighters that were truly his own same size, no, he barely won any of those fights. He didn't win against Roy Jones Jr. in their first matchup. He only beat Roy Jones when Roy Jones was completely washed up in a shell of himself. He didn't beat Joe Calzaghe when they were both within a top 5 pound for pound. He didn't defeat Jermaine Taylor. He didn't defeat Chad Dawson. So it's like, why overall do people say that Bernard Hopkins' unification was one of the greatest unifications of all time? He beat Felix Tito Trinidad. Every other opponent that he beat in that division for the unification, they were pretty much whack juice. Let's just be real. Name me one fighter that you can remember that was an A-grade fighter that Bernard Hopkins beat besides Felix Tito Trinidad for that unification. You can't name me one. You can't name me one.
Recently, guys like even Usyk and Jermell Charlo, especially Charlo, because this is the thing.
Well, in my view, if you're asking me to rank those unifications, so if we were to talk about those 4 fighters and their unifications, who would I put at the top of the list? All in all, I probably would put Canelo Alvarez, and some people would heavily disagree with me. There's going to be some people that say, oh, you're just a Canelo dick rider. Listen, I'm not a dick rider for any of these fighters. I'm not a fanboy of any of these fighters. All I state is, what I believe is the truth from my perspective. If you disagree with me, that's okay. But every single thing that I'm going to state, I have several points to. Why do I have Canelo Alvarez at the #1 unification, at least for this era? Because when you talk about Callum Smith, Billy Joe Saunders, and Caleb Plant, sure, we can make the excuse all we want to that those guys were, according to people, these weak European white boys, but all those guys had decent boxing pedigree. When Billy Joe Saunders versus Demetrius Bubo Andrade was looked at as a fight that was about to be announced, everyone was excited for that fight. And they weren't just excited for the fight because Billy Joe Saunders had a great amount of hype around him, it was a great fight because Billy Joe Saunders was looked at as an A-grade fighter. He was one of the few undefeated fighters at the 160-pound weight division. And when he fought Canelo Alvarez, he pretty much was at the best point in his career, and he was undefeated. No, he's not known for having a great amount of power, but he is known for being a slickster when it came down to it. All in all, there was a certain amount of fighters that gave him a lot of respect, including Floyd Mayweather Jr. Even Floyd said that when it came to Canelo and Billy Joe Saunders, Floyd said, do not underestimate Billy Joe Saunders because he is a decently great fighter. Okay, so Billy Joe Saunders was a very decent fighter. You had Callum Smith. Now, Callum, in my opinion, he's not really a slickster, but he's really a fighter that probably should be fighting at 175 pounds. He has extraordinary power, and he was undefeated at the time. He knocked out George Groves at the last point in his career. He also was the first one to knock out Rocky Fielding and a couple of other dudes. And Canelo Alvarez was basically able to make him look like an amateur. And then you had Caleb Plant, who was able to beat Jose Uzcategui. And then I believe Caleb Truax, two former champions. And Caleb Plant was able to beat both of them, who was also a great slickster and also was a person that had decent boxing ability. And Canelo was able to beat all three of those guys. No, he didn't face David Benavidez, and he didn't face Jamal Charlo, but of course Charlo, he wasn't there at 168 at the time. No, he didn't defeat David Benavidez, but still the fighters that he beat were all very decent. When you talk about Terence Bud Crawford unifying at 140 pounds, I think that, unifying a division, no matter what the division, is still a great accomplishment. But let's be real. Who are the fighters that you won the titles over? First of all, you beat, Thomas Delorme, that one, Puerto Rican fighter who's pretty much known as a B or C grade fighter. So are we really going to count that guy as an A grade fighter, a fighter that has never even been a champion? And then his next title victory, I believe, was against Victor Postal. Now, that was a decently great win at the time, but when we really take a look at it in hindsight, Victor Postal was never truly an A-grade fighter, or at least a fighter that clearly was never at least on the A+ or A level. Now, he did defeat Lucas Matisse, but there really is even a debate if Lucas Matisse is an A-grade fighter. You're talking about someone that's pretty much lost every big fight in his career. So it just is what it is now. But if you wanted to say that that's at least on the A- level, you could. But then we have Joyous Ndango. We all know that Joyous Ndango is not an A-grade fighter. Never was. All right, just is what it is. Those are the facts of the situation. So let's move on to Jamel Charlo, and then we'll go on to Alexander Usyk. Jamel Charlo, you can debate, is anywhere from second to third, in my opinion, of the best unification, for those divisions, since it's debatable. When we talk about Jamel Charlo, the one thing that I will overall give him an edge over Usyk, at least in terms of the unification, is that there was that one 50-50 fight to where no one truly knew who was going to win, or at least certain people, if you took a look at it on the surface when it came to Jamel Charlo. And Jamel was able to win those fights against Brian Castano. So Jamel, in my view, probably had the second best unification out of all those guys. But the rest of the champions there, they were not that good, like Tony Harrison and Erickson Lubin, and all in all, a couple of other fighters like Jason Rosario. I'm sorry, but none of those fighters that I just mentioned are A-grade fighters. They're just not. And most of those fighters that I just mentioned, or at least some of them, all in all, they overall were kind of lucky to get to the place that they were in the first place. So it just is what it is. So then we talk about Alexander Usyk. I probably would have him in third place. The cruiserweight division was ripe with undefeated, talented fighters at the time. He was able to defeat Murat Gassiev, Tony Bellew, who was not undefeated but still very decent. He was able to defeat Maurice Bradis and a couple of other fighters. So you could debate that Alexander Usyk's unification is anywhere from second to third. But the weakest unification out of all four of them is Terence Bud Crawford. The most powerful one, or the most impactful one in my view, is Canelo Alvarez. And not everyone's going to agree with that. But all in all, those are just the facts of the situation. Because when we talk about the most amount of pedigree fighters beaten within the weight division out of all those unifications, it clearly is Canelo. And there's really no debate about it. Just is what it is.
I think anyone really dislikes Usyk. However, you got old media and they dislike Charlo, or at least that's what they act like, they dislike him. You know what I mean? So,
well, you claim that old media dislikes Jamel Charlo because they don't put him on the top 10 pound per pound list. I don't have him on my top 10 pound per pound list either. And now some people, of course, may say, why would you not have him on your top 10 pound per pound list? That's a little bit ridiculous. Don't you think that that's biased? No, not whatsoever. And I have a logical point to explain it. Once again, this is not a channel to where I'm super duper biased. Everything that I explain on this channel can be explained with a logical reasoning. When you have the top 5 pound per pound fighters, you're talking about fighters like Terence Crawford, Errol Spence Jr., Canelo Alvarez, Alexander Usyk, and Tyson Fury. Because not only have those guys accomplished a lot, but they have either multiple A-grade fighters on the resume or they have somewhat of an A-grade resume. And most of those guys are undefeated, or like Canelo, they had a several-year stretch to where they were very dominant over repeated A-grade fighters. So that is the difference first off. So then we go to the bottom 5. So here's the real question about Mr. Jermell Charlo, even though he did just recently unify the weight divisions. But let's also keep this in mind. Just a couple of years ago, when he was still looked at the best point in his career, he lost to Tony Harrison, who was always known for getting knocked out and losing in every single big championship fight before he ended up beating Jermell Charlo. And that pretty much was a Jermell Charlo that was at the peak of his career. So the big question is this. On the top 10 pound per pound list, we already know that the fighters that I just mentioned, he's not above those fighters. At least not in my view. He's not above Crawford. He's not above Usyk. He's not above Spence. He's not above Fury. And he's not above Canelo. He's not above any of those fighters. So the question is this. Is he even above these fighters? Is he above a Devin Haney, who is undefeated and recently unified over George Kambosos? Is he above a Shakur Stevenson, who's a two-weight division champion and is undefeated and looks more skilled, and on top of that just beat Oscar Valdez, who you could claim is about on the same level as Brian Castano, maybe even above, some would argue. Is he even above a Dimitri Bivol, who is undefeated and is never unified, but probably debatably has a better resume overall than Jermell Charlo? And on top of that, he is undefeated and looks more skilled for his weight division. Is he above Artur Beterbiev, who is undefeated and almost completely unified in that division and has looked like the most dominant fighter on the planet for the past couple of years? Is he above Naoya Inoue? Is he above overall Josh Taylor? Is he above some of those fighters that I just mentioned? I'm not 100% sure if he's above any of those fighters definitively. So people will make a big case about how they believe Jermell Charlo, that he has to be on the top 10 pound per pound list, and in fact that he has to be even top 5. But when we really break it down logically and objectively, it actually makes sense that Jermell Charlo may not be on the pound per pound list, because I just gave you several logical reasonings for that right then and there.
More so than Usyk, Jermell still gets doubted by people. At least old media, they still doubt him. They still doubt his worth and his capability, and that.
Well, it's no offense against Jermell Charlo, but in my view, we're going to see truly how great Jermell Charlo is when he finally faces an A+ or an A-grade fighter. I'm sorry, but Brian Castano, even for how good I think that he is, he's not an A+ or an A-grade fighter. Just is what it is. We're going to see how great Jermell Charlo is when either A, he moves up to 160 pounds, and maybe might be able to handle slightly bigger fighters if there is any real A-grade challenges there, or B, we're going to figure out how good he is when he faces Terence Bud Crawford or Errol Spence or whoever the winner of that fight is. Because if I had to be honest, I don't think Jermell Charlo beats either of them. Whoever the winner is or whoever the victor is of that Terence Bud Crawford and Errol Spence Jr. fight, I do not think Jermell Charlo beats either of them. I don't think he beats either of them. I don't think he beats Errol Spence. I don't think he beats Crawford. I think both of them are too skilled, and I think that they have just enough size to handle him.
Type of thing. That's the main difference between, a situation with Usyk. Usyk, he's kind of a likable guy. Everyone seems to kind of enjoy him. So he wasn't.
Well, certain people enjoy him besides that in new media and the LDBC because they don't want him on the top of the pound per pound list. But if there was a bunch of people debating him as number one, which certain people could debate, they would have a very big problem with him, just like they did with Lomachenko and Canelo.
Up against it. When you a certain fighter and people don't like you, especially black fighters, black American fighters at that, if the fans, don't like your personality, they'll start wagering all these things into their predictions and, oh, Castano beat you, Charlo, and you looked horrible, and, starting.
Well, in my opinion, saying that Castano beat Charlo, that's not really all in all a personal issue that a person has. In most opinions, Charlo should have lost that first fight. And all in all, I look at myself as a decently logical and objective commentator. I thought Charlo lost that fight. Not only did I think that he lost that fight, I thought he lost that fight 8 rounds to 4. I thought that was a very, very poor judging, session. Now in the second fight, Jermell Charlo was outboxing him, no doubt about it. Brian Gastano just was not doing enough in that fight, and that's pretty much what I predicted what would happen. But at the end of the day, no, that first fight he did not look very good in that first fight at all. Now, is there a certain amount of fans that because they have an emotional issue or because they're a fanboy or they're trying to tear down a certain fighter? Will they state all in all that they believe this fighter won, even though more than likely they probably didn't? Yeah, sure. When it comes down to it, like there's many people that would tell you that Floyd lost the Manny Pacquiao fight. For those of us that are damn logical and objective, we know that that certainly is not the case. But when it comes down to Jermell Charlo and Brian Gastano, no, Jermell Charlo probably should have lost that first fight. Period.
embellishing and overdoing it, and then Charlo come back fight the same dude that y'all said beat him, and said no way it was a draw, and he come back and sleep the dude and drop him several times.
Right, and that is a great thing that Mr. Jermell Charlo was able to do. But in my view, Brian Gastano was never an A-plus fighter to begin with.
And this is a guy that's never been dropped, to my knowledge, and he definitely had never been stopped, and that's even by the likes of Erislandy Lara, a champion, Patrick.
Right, but when he fought Erislandy Lara, Lara was a bit older and probably not the same fighter. Lara has not been the same fighter for the past 5 years.
Teixeira, nobody did.
Patrick Teixeira was one of the weakest champions in boxing in the recent era. So let's not bring that up.
Charlo did to him. So it's really, I'm not going to say hard to argue. It's,
hey, Grant Cardone here. What if I told you in 4 hours I could change everything about your life from the way you think to how much...
To argue, it's impossible to argue that Jermell Charlo, his ascension to the undisputed bag and undisputed belts status has been greater than Terence Crawford at 140. And then
well, I'm not going to say that it's 100% impossible, but I would not argue it. It just is what it is because, once again, the difference between Terence Bud Crawford's and Jermell Charlo's unification divisions is that Jermell Charlo has the slight edge over him, in my view, because he was able to beat Brian Gastano. Terence Crawford, of course, had that fight against Victor Postal, but do any of us really take a look at Victor Postal as better than Brian Gastano? I don't see it. So it just is what it is. So I give Jermell Charlo the slight edge in that category. Maybe even slightly over Usyk if you wanted to get him that. Even though I think the, weight division that Usyk overall unified, that, cruiserweight actually was very decently, talented at the time. So if you wanted to debate Usyk as, maybe slightly over Jermell Charlo in terms of that unification, I certainly wouldn't mind. But when it comes down to it, I would agree with Ego that Terence, in my view, that it probably was not as good of a unification as Jermell Charlo's. Even though, in my view, I think that Jermell Charlo's unification in terms of the boxing talent, it's quite overrated by some of these channels that try to state on and on that it's one of the deepest divisions in boxing. No, the last time that 154 was a very deep division in boxing was when Canelo and Lara and Trout and both Charlo brothers and Demetrius Bubu Andrade. That's when that division was last very, very richly talented. Or maybe if we even want to go a little bit after then, when J-Rock was there and Jamal Charlo and Erislandy Lara, maybe even slightly after Canelo left. But once overall Jamal Charlo left that division overall was, in my view, it became a decent amount weaker.
Terence Crawford fights Errol Spence. He's got 3 belts to your 1, so Errol Spence would be the fight. But I still can't even compare that because here's the difference. Herein lies the problem. Terence Crawford has fought guys that, for the most part, with Top Rank, his last several fights, and he was with Top Rank for the last 10, 11 years, we knew those guys weren't the ones that could even probably beat him at the stage of their career.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for saying that. And I'm also going to release another video that I reviewed recently by Aki TV. These guys will literally try, or at least some of these channels, will literally try to tell you that Terence Bud Crawford, they'll tell you straight to your face that they think that Aegis Kavalaskas and Jose Benavidez and Felix Diaz are A-grade level fighters. Like, come on, man. Who are you trying to fool?
Here's when they fought him, right? And those are the fights that Crawford got. Those are the fights that he got. So, it is what it is. But even if he were to fight again, even if he were to fight Errol Spence, that's literally one fight. That's one fight. And yeah, you'll be undisputed, but your journey to it was, Jose Benavidez after he got shot, Mean Machine fights, and Jeff Horn.
Well, listen, Mr. Eagle, I understand that, but the thing is this: if Terence Bud Crawford ends up defeating Errol Spence Jr., he is going to be the undisputed number one pound for pound fighter. Whoever more than likely wins that fight is going to be the undisputed number one pound for pound fighter, especially Terence Bud Crawford. Now, if Errol Spence wins that fight, there may be a little bit of pushback just because he's only had work within one weight division. But if Terence Bud Crawford wins that fight, he's going to be probably the most arguable undisputed pound for pound fighter, at least all in all, if he is going to win that fight.
Who I thought didn't even beat Pacquiao, blase blah. You know what I mean? So it's different than
Well, Jeff Horn, in my opinion, could have debatably beat Manny Pacquiao, but like I said, there's many situations to where they ended up beating a very good champion, but they really did not belong in that spot in the first place. Because the reason why they ended up winning was because more than likely that elite talent did not take that fight very seriously. Like when Teofimo Lopez fought George Kambosos, or overall when Buster Douglas beat Mike Tyson, or when Kelly Pavlik beat Jermaine Taylor. Of course, I'd have to rewatch those fights. It's been such a while, but like that, like those are examples of fighters that ended up winning, but they weren't they weren't really A grade fighters. Jeff Horn and Manny Pacquiao was another example of that.
Who's fighting Tony Harrison's and fighting Jason Rosario after he stopped J Rock, and J Rock was coming off probably a career.
Well, I understand that, Mr. Boxing Eagle, but Jason Rosario and J. Rock Williams, that's also a very similar situation. Jason Rosario is not the talent of what a Julian J. Rock Williams is. It's just that Julian J. Rock Williams, first of all, doesn't have that great of a chin. And all in all, sometimes in certain fights, he just makes too many mistakes for his own good. Jason Rosario was never an A-grade fighter. Now, don't get me wrong, he was able to get the stoppage over, over what the hell was his name? Julian J. Rock Williams. He's also the same guy that ended up getting stopped by Erickson Lubin, and we all know his caliber, I believe, within about 5 or 6 rounds. So Jason Rosario is not that good. I'm sorry.
Her best performance over Jared Hurd in Jared Hurd's backyard. You got to look at the pedigree. You got to look. See,
I understand your point, Mr. Ego, but had Jamel Charlo beat Jarrett Hurd and J. Rock Williams, I think that, in my view, it would have been looked at as probably much, much more deep. But Jason Rosario is not. Jason Rosario is not an A-grade fighter. I'm sorry, he just isn't.
Just look at the names on the faces and stuff on the box rec. I know boxing, so I know the time in which you fought, the circumstances in which you fought. Did you have a full camp? Did you have momentum? Were you coming off recent, explosive, electrifying performances? Were you coming off recent, explosive, electrifying performances? Like Jason Rosario, he's big. He's bigger than Charlo, Jermell at least. And
I'm actually not quite so sure about that. Last time I seen that fight, Jason Rosario didn't look bigger than Jamel Charlo, but it's been a while since I watched that fight, so I would have to remember. Either way, we all know that Jason Rosario is not an A-grade fighter. As soon as I seen all in all that fight was set up, I knew who the winner was going to be immediately. Because if that was a true 50-50 fight, Jamel Charlo does not take him out within that certain amount of time as what he does. I understand what you're trying to say, Mr. Ego, but let's be real. Jason Rosario is not an A-grade fighter.
He was coming off an explosive win over J Rock in Philly, and J Rock was coming off the DC fight with.
He was, but J Rock, in my view, heavily underestimated him, and on top of that, J Rock is just too flawed of a fighter. I think that had Jamel Charlo beat a peak Jarrett Hurd and beat all in all a peak, J Rock Williams, or at least a J Rock Williams coming off, the Jarrett Hurd fight, those would have been, in my view, A-grade wins. But Jason Rosario is not an A-grade win. I'm sorry.
Jared Hurd. I mean, there's levels to it, so you can't really deny what Jermel's doing. Now, as far as the comment he said about Erickson Lubin, that's actually a good point. I really have one of my major questions is this: is how would Terence Crawford? How is he going to fare with bigger dudes at 54? Because he said he wants to move up, and he's at the age, just had a birthday, I think. He's 35 years old now. So he's at a space where he's probably going to move up soon, especially if the Errol Spence fight don't happen. Probably going to because he looks like he's putting on some size and putting on mass. But my thing is, every division you got to treat it like you hit reset on the video game. It's a brand new situation, and moving up is a process and it takes time. And this is not no Jeff Horn, like moving up and fighting the Jeff Horn who really did.
I would agree with that. 154 would be very interesting, but when it comes to Terence Bud Crawford, I just don't know if I see any major threats for him at 154, unless maybe he was going to face someone like a Sebastian Fundora. Now, some of you are saying, why would you mention Sebastian Fundora and not someone like a Jamel Charlo? Because the only problem I could really maybe see Terence Bud Crawford having at that division is maybe if someone majorly outsizes him, like that of a Sebastian Fundora, or maybe if he fought someone that was very decently bigger, maybe who could even be naturally a 160 pounder. Every other fight within that division, I just don't see how they beat Crawford. I don't see how they beat Spence either, because I just don't think it's that talented of a division. Does anyone truly think that Jason Rosario or or Tony Harrison is going to beat Terence Bud Crawford? I mean, they might be a little bit bigger than him, but they're certainly not A-grade fighters.
Beat Pacquiao. Erickson Lubin, he fighting a 6'7". You
Now, what would have been interesting to see is if Terence Bud Crawford would have beat Canelo Alvarez at 154 pounds, or someone like a Araceli Lara when he was at his prime, or maybe someone like a Jamal Charlo. Those would have been very interesting fights.
know, tarantula with arms, or it looked like a tree boxing in Fedora, and he was hurt badly, and he showed crazy heart, got back up, and dropped Fedora. So Erickson Lubin is a crafty southpaw.
Did he say a tarantula with arms? I'm not. I'm not really 100% sure what the hell his point was. I guess maybe that he's super lengthy. Anyway,
People underrate him and undermine him because of his losses, but I think that would be a difficult fight for Terence Crawford, and especially
I think more than likely Terence Bud Crawford would knock out Erickson Lubin. The fights that I think, if you were to move up at 154, that would be decently challenging, would more than likely be Fundora, maybe Charlo. That's a big maybe in my opinion. And there might be one other. But, really all 154 right now, in my view, is just not that overtly talented.
anybody who's a natural southpaw like Errol Spence and bigger guys like Erickson Lubin that have athleticism and southpaw, I really would like to see how Crawford would fare with those guys because Jamil shut him out in one round. I definitely don't see Crawford moving up to 54 and stopping him in one round like Jamel Charlo. So Jamil,
He may not stop him in one round, but, because Jamel is bigger than Crawford. But I believe on the know that Terence Bud Crawford, if you're asking me who would win the Jamel Charlo Terence Bud Crawford fight, I would go with Terence Bud Crawford. The only way I think Jamel Charlo wins that fight is if he makes it super uncomfortable. And even then, I don't think that he's going to beat Crawford. The way that he would have to beat Crawford, in my view, is to probably get a good shot in there and probably knock Terence Bud Crawford out.
bringing up some good points. Drop your thoughts in the comment section. I'm the best in the business, but y'all knew that. And I'm out. A lot.
But anyways, that's really about it for this video. I just thought that was very particularly interesting. But anyways, thank you so much for watching. All in all, it is going to be very particularly interesting to see if the Terence Bud Crawford and Errol Spence Jr. fight does end up happening, which I hope that it does. And we'll see all in all what ends up happening. As for Mr. Jamel Charlo, overall and his unification, do I believe that, his unification was that much better than Terence Bud Crawford's? No, I don't. And the reason why that is because I don't really think much of the fighters that Jamel beat were A grade. I also don't think much of the fighters that Terence Bud Crawford beat at 140 were A grade. So even though I'd give Jamel Charlo the slight edge because of the Brian Castano performance in the rematch, it's not by much. So it is what it is, at least in terms of the whole career. Now, 140, maybe you can debate it, but anyways, that's really about it for this video. I just thought that was particularly interesting. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll talk to you all later.